Hello and welcome back to Study History with Mr. P, and this GCSE history topic summary is for the Anglo-Saxon and Norman England topic, and it looks at Anglo-Saxon society. So the king that we start with when we look at Anglo-Saxon and Norman England is King Edward the Confessor. He was the most powerful man in England because he led the army, and this man was also very religious and he was a respected lawmaker. But in many respects his power was limited because he relied heavily upon the earls, especially the Godwins, and half of the country in England also followed Danelaw. So how was society structured in Anglo-Saxon England? Well, as I said, the king was at the top, he controlled the country and the groups below him. But he relied heavily, as I said, on the earls, especially because many of them came from the same family, the Godwin family at this time. So the earls led the king's armies and protected his lands. They were loyal to the king, but they could also challenge him to try and get more power, especially because the Anglo-Saxon earldoms were vast in size. Now, below the earls were a number of thanes. These were like the local lords that worked for each of the earls. They were the important warrior class in Anglo-Saxon times that would gather soldiers during times of war, but equally this was part of the reason why the Anglo-Saxon earls were so powerful, because the thanes often saw their loyalty first to them rather than the king. Now, next in society were the churls, the free farmers or free peasant farmers. They were free because they weren't tied to any single lord to work, and so they could travel the country wherever they liked to work, so long as obviously they could get land and get work. But the vast majority of society in Anglo-Saxon times were peasants, peasant farmers who would work on farms in exchange for living on the lord's lands. They could not work elsewhere because they were therefore tied to their land, but below the peasants in Anglo-Saxon society were the slaves, who made up about 10% of society, of the population, and they were seen as tools or property of their owner. And in this time, people would sometimes sell themselves into slavery, perhaps to pay off their debt, and then once they paid off their debt, would go back to being a peasant farmer. Now, Anglo-Saxon society was relatively fluid, and what I mean by this is somebody could move up and down within society. So, for example, somebody could buy themselves out of slavery and become a peasant. A peasant who worked hard could become a churl, a free farmer. Equally, a merchant who did really well could become higher up within society too, and people who fell on hard times could move down the social system. Okay, now I've said that the king, Edward the Confessor, did rely upon his earls, but this didn't mean that he was not powerful. So the king had a number of powers in Anglo-Saxon times. First of all, land ownership. So the king owned large estates and could grant land to his followers, and he could to some extent take land away from those who acted against him. The king was also responsible for creating and maintaining new laws and making sure that they were enforced across the country. And equally, the king's main responsibility was the protection of his people from attack. The king also controlled the production of silver pennies that were used as money, which meant he was in control of finance across the country, and the king decided when taxes would be paid, and a national taxation system made sure that he got those taxes. The king also had the ability to raise the national army and fleet, so the navy. The people of Anglo-Saxon England also held a number of duties, or had a number of duties that they had to perform. So landowners, for example, had to provide and equip fighters for the army or fleet, or they could be fined or even lose their lands. People had to use the king's coins, and forgery was seen as a very serious crime. People equally had to pay their taxes or could be fined or lose their land. And land, as I've already said, carried with it obligations to pay taxes and also to carry out military service and to provide fighters for war. When somebody reached the age of 12, they had to also swear an oath of loyalty to the king, and all people had to obey the law as it was passed down through the king's representatives. Okay, so thank you for taking the time to watch this video. You may also wish to compare it to some of my later videos about Norman England to see how government and structure and so on changed during Norman times. Thank you.